Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Rachel Iacono. On this week's episode, Theresa Cardinal Brown hosts special guest Allen Orr, President-elect of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, for a timely discussion of Black immigrants in the immigration system. More of that to come. Stick around. In honor of Black History Month, today's podcast will dive into racial equity in the immigration system and how the Biden administration may or may not be addressing specific issues for Black immigrants today. Since President Biden has arrived at the White House, his administration has extended deferred and forced departure for Liberians and passed legislation to extend the period for applications for the Liberian Refugee Immigration Fairness Act, which allowed long-term Liberians in the United States to get green cards. His future immigration reform bill would expand the diversity visa lottery program, which allows many Africans an opportunity to immigrate to the United States. Simultaneously, however, Immigration and Customs Enforcement has resumed deportations of Haitians and Cameroonians after a Trump-appointed Texas judge ruled against Biden's 100-day suspension of deportations. In addition, questions remain as to whether the White House's regional approach to Central American migration could help African and Caribbean asylum seekers, and whether the administration will bring a racial equity lens to immigration law and policy. To help us unpack these recent events is Allen Orr. Allen is an immigration attorney and the founder of Orr Immigration Law Firm PC, a minority-owned law firm based here in Washington, D.C. He is a proud graduate of Morehouse College and earned his law degree from Howard University. He is an active member of the D.C., Virginia, and National Bar Associations and is the president-elect of the American Immigration Lawyers Association and is the first Black and openly gay individual to lead the organization. Most importantly, he is a friend of the BPC. Allen, welcome to the show. I'll leave you in Theresa's capable hands to kick off the discussion.
Thank you, Rachel, and hello, Allen. Welcome to This Week in Immigration.
Happy to be here.
So you just heard Rachel describing some of the actions the new administration has taken that may have particular significance to Black immigrants. But let me ask you just generally, what do you think is the current state of immigration law and policy as it relates to immigrants who are Black? And is there fairness or equity in the system? What do you think might be missing?
So we have a lot of challenges because the first thing when you think of an immigrant, you don't think of someone who's Black. So that's the first overreaching challenge. And then on top of that, we have this big social justice issue that is surrounding all the United States, whether you're immigrant or not immigrant. And so when a person of color is stopped, the first question that isn't asked is their immigration status because of the enforcement procedures that happen in all of the Black communities around the country. So over-policing, the tension-building police, and sort of enforcement is everywhere. And so that's why a large number of Black immigrants get caught up in deportation because they live in these over-policed societies. And that leads to a greater proportion of Africans and Black people and Caribbeans being deported from the United States. And so the issue is really, how are we going to address both of these issues? Because you just can't address half of that person as just being an immigrant without also addressing the social issue.
Yeah, so that's very interesting. You start out with that proposition because obviously in America, we tend to think of immigration as mainly a Hispanic issue. And I do want to point out that many Hispanics are Black too. So you add in that identity. But you just pointed out sort of this intersection that as we have seen sort of the criminal justice system and the immigration system interact, how that is having an impact on immigrants of color and particularly Black immigrants. Talk a little bit about how that intersection came about. Like, when did we start really sort of integrating the criminal justice system and the immigration system?
Right. So it really has never, ever really been separated. A lot of the things that this country is built on are sort of some of these prejudices that exist and permutate themselves over and over again in our racist policies. And that's why in 1965, we sort of thought we fixed the Immigration Act to sort of this racial equality, and it just changed it and exacerbated it for other parts in other countries. And so there really has never really been a separation. The recognition of Black immigrants hasn't really ever happened either until you sort of see enforcement stories. A lot of Black immigrants were those people who were caught up in New York who were shot on the streets by cops or they were police were first generation immigrants. As a priority right now, 1 in 4 blacks in this country have an immigration lineage, either to the Caribbean or to the mainland Africa. So that's a lot of people. And as you said before, even in Latin America, some people have black heritage that just don't recognize it because they just say it's easier to be Latin. So the fact that you're Latin doesn't exclude you from being black. And a lot of these movements are now moving together. And you see that mostly in the DACA movement, where the face of DACA really is a Hispanic group of people. But a lot of DACA, specifically on the East Coast, are black people from either Africa or from the Caribbean.
Yeah, yeah. So what do we know about, for example, the undocumented black population in the United States? How large is it? And you mentioned a lot of them on the East Coast, from the Caribbean, from Africa. Is that the concentration?
Yeah, so yeah, it is mostly on the East Coast and somewhere on the West Coast. The box checks around 4 million individuals, and that's people who determined in themselves that they're going to identify as black, right? There are a lot of other categories that sort of exist, as there are black Irish people, right? Immigrants went everywhere, and people sort of migrate, and then they choose different boxes for whatever reason. So what's important about the U.S. policy, I think, in immigration is that it removes that race button altogether, and that everybody sort of gets this equal treatment. What we see in immigration is the same thing that we see overall in policy, the stratification of we prefer rich people over poor people. We prefer light-skinned people over dark-skinned people. We prefer First Nations, as they like to say, over developing nations. And that needs to be corrected. If we're going to be this country that sort of has this equality and equality at the border, we need to sort of say, we welcome all immigrants the same. Because as we know, many people, many companies that have started here have started by some refugees and have gone on to be the leading companies in the United States. And that's sort of the story of everything. And specifically now when we look at our vice president, the first black woman, first Asian woman vice president is the descendant of 2 different categories of immigrants that come to this country in large numbers. And it's time to start recognizing that. As a matter of fact, our first black president also had an immigrant father.
Yeah. So you just described, I think, some myth busting about black immigrants in the United States. What are some of the things that people maybe don't know about many black immigrants to the United States who come from all over the world, as you mentioned?
Right. So I think a lot of people don't recognize the strong connection that that country has to Haiti, which is part of the lineage that I also share, and the recognition that Haiti sent people here after it was free to actually work in our civil wars. It was a big movement in the civil rights movement. Caribbean culture sort of infused Louisiana, right? So the reason that there is even Louisiana is because Napoleon had to sell it to fund the battle that was happening in Haiti. So all of these sort of cultures sort of mend together. And then New York is just a melting pot of all these immigrant populations. Then you also don't recognize that these black women from Nigeria are the highest educated population we have in the country by far, by numbers and perspective. So that's something that you sort of miss out, some of these doctors that are here in these different areas. But what you also miss out on is sort of how they rebuild culture, how they start reviving neighborhoods. Specifically in DC, where I live, the Ethiopian population has actually revitalized all of U Street with restaurants, clubs, and food and diversity and culture. And it sort of mends together with the African American culture of saying, this is part of your heritage too, also from the homeland. So just because the boat stopped in the Caribbean before they got here doesn't sort of make them a different type of people, where we all share sort of this lineage of music and understanding. And so it depends on where you sort of want to connect. I think a lot of the connection really happens in music and food, and also the understanding of family and relationships. And I think that for me, and you sort of see wealth building among black immigrants that come here, generally within the first generation, there's a higher level of education and a higher level of wealth than the immigrants that originally arrived here, because of the value of what the country adds.
Yeah, yeah. So you just raised an interesting question to me, because you mentioned slavery, and obviously that's how a lot of black people came to the Western Hemisphere throughout our history in that unfortunate time. But, the African Americans, the descendants of American slaves in the United States, grew up in a particular black culture. How do black immigrants address that when they arrive? Because they came from a different culture, and suddenly there's that intersection in the United States. What have you seen and heard from your clients, from compatriots, from others about how that those two issues intersect?
And also from family, yeah. So
family.
I have family, and so the black culture is not a monolith, right? So there's different depending on where you come from. Depending on if you're from Europe, you sort of see the African American from what you've seen portrayed on television. They suffer from the same sort of things as programming that happens around the world. And you have other immigrants that come in, and you sort of say, well, your parents weren't linked to slavery, and so we're a little bit different. But the conversation is, how are you treated when you walk in the door? Does someone see you as the immigrant from abroad, or if someone sees you as the black person from slavery? There really isn't a clear line from that. And the history of slavery goes beyond many of the continents, the colonization of England and everywhere else. So this conversation about oppression of people of color and raping sort of African culture and all that thing is a larger conversation for everyone to have. So no one's sort of freed of that history. I mean, I think it doesn't sort of empower someone to say, well, my people were never part of the slave trade that was here. The conversation that exists is the same one that exists in every immigration conversation, this pitting of immigrations against one another, saying to black immigrants, you're taking away from blacks that were born here. And that's just not the conversation. That doesn't happen at any church where you say, our church is full, you can't come in. You make the table bigger. There's room for everyone. And if someone's saying someone's taking your X, then they're probably the person who's actually taking it, because it's just pitting you against each other to have this sort of closed society of this versus. And that just doesn't need to happen anywhere. And in most cases within the black culture, you see all of these cultures sort of mending together, where a lot of people aren't sort of, at HBCUs, you see a large population of black immigrants. And so they marry Americans, and that heritage just sort of fuses together and sort of moves forward. And once I said before, when you think about freedom in North America, you can't start talking about it until you talk about Haiti, because that was the first free nation here. And when you start talking about the conditions and what's sort of owed, and in their mind, France owes them a lot of money for slavery that they'll never get. And that's sort of the concept that sort of happens here with African Americans right now in this conversation and immigrants. So I don't think you can really separate them. But I think the conversation has been for that black population that are here, for those congressional people who also have immigrant heritage, to understand that immigration is a black issue. It's important to our communities. It's important to see together. It's important to see oppression across the board among people of color and people who are striving to make conditions better for themselves.
Yeah. So the Biden administration has made a very public point of stating that they want to bring racial equity to the forefront of all of their policy makings. They've signed a few executive orders, and we know that there's immigration legislation that hopefully will be introduced pretty soon. But what do you think they might be able to accomplish in immigration policy? And where do you think specifically that racial equity lens needs to focus as we think about reforms to our immigration system?
So as an HBCU grad, I know that the arch for justice is long, and I think we're a long way from that. And one of the things that they have to do is sort of prime the system, because you just can't reform some racist people. Some people might have racist tendencies from lack of education, but other people are just racist. And a lot of those people are in our immigration and enforcement system, and a lot of them hold high positions within the government and DHS, and they basically have to be primed out of the system and sort of removed. And part of that is removing the policies, but also part of that is sort of watching the discretion. Once Biden took office, he said that he was going to halt deportations. And as soon as he did the halt for deportation, Texas stood up to battle him in court. But people within ICE started loading up Haitians immediately to a country that's in political turmoil right now and deporting them. They were taking Cameroonians back home, deporting them instantly, trying to do it overnight. The number of planes that were going to destinations of where there were black people were more than the numbers of planes going to destinations where there were not black people. And that's problematic. When you can look at this and say, is there some trend I see here? And the trend that you will see is that those immigrants were black. The same thing about private prisons and these sort of problems where they're having in these ICE detention centers, where they're sort of doing these unneeded health facilities. Most of those immigrants were black. They were deporting black immigrants. They were black immigrants who got hysterectomies. When you think about the first case of foul child separation, not the ones you see on the news, but the ones you sort of see in court, it's a black immigrant talking about their kids being separated. When you talk about the southern border and the Remain in Mexico policy, it impacts mostly people who are not from Latin America, who don't speak Spanish. We're talking about African people who are there, forced into Mexico, who are being repressed in Mexico because of our policy of not sort of either just giving them the due process. The concept isn't to say everybody's welcome to come. The concept is to follow the law that we have and to administer visas as they come, including asylum. And everybody has their day in court, and if it doesn't work out, they don't get to stay. But we don't get to force people away, and we don't get to say, well, because of your hue or because of your country or because your family doesn't have enough wealth, this public wealth charge, you're not able to stay here. So the Biden has a heavy lift because it has to fight two battles. One is just the immigration battle as a whole, but the other one is the long history of racism that sort of exists in this country that will always be pitted against people of color until there's a recognition of saying, okay, look, we have this problem. We can look at the numbers. We can look at the deportations and say this isn't right. We can look at the way we administer TPS. This isn't fair. We can look at the way that right now there's this big hole in diversity visas and ending diversity visas when that's a lot of the way people come from the continent. When you sort of think about public charge and who it impacts, right? Once again, it is poor people and people of color.
Yeah. So I mean, a lot of it, as you said, is sort of how we enforce the laws we have. But are there structural issues with the laws? As you mentioned, the 1965 Act supposedly treated everybody equally. But do you feel like there's some issues with how the law is written itself that maybe disproportionately impact immigrants from Black countries or majority Black countries?
I think, yeah, so for me, it's always the administration of those policies. So when I talk about people of color, I'm not going to leave out the people from South Asia because some of those people are also of color. So fixing the 1965 Act is true. And the biggest problem is you just need to accept more numbers. This concept that protecting of the whiteness of America is going to end naturally by birth, or we can go ahead and accept it and say to let immigrants in because we're going to have to replace our dying population. And we can't pick and choose what areas we want that from. It needs to be sort of an open, equitable system to people who add here. And if race is a factor in categorizing who's allowed to come in, then we're not living by the principles that we say we are as American. And that's the problem. And for most of these immigrants that we have waiting for some reason, they're already here. So what's the fiction about waiting to get something? Waiting to pay more taxes, waiting for their kids to age out, waiting to cost more money? It's sort of a false system. Everything we do here is done to sort of vet people and vet people and vet people and vet people. When we saw recently the people who charged up on our own form of government were not immigrants. They were native-born citizens who were born here who should have known better.
So I'm going to ask you a few questions sort of about the politics around this. Oftentimes the immigration legislation is funneled through groups like the Congressional Hispanic Caucus and the Congressional Progressive Caucus, but the Congressional Black Caucus has been a very big player in immigration reform legislation debates over the last several years, in particular fighting for family reunification visas and the diversity visa program. That seems to be a huge priority that they have had. Why do you think that is, and what role do you think they can play moving forward in sort of broadening out that scope to all of these other issues in the immigration system that you've just mentioned?
Right now, and also sort of fixing TPS, which is improperly named, and the DACA. And
sure, temporary protected status for any of our listeners who don't know what TPS is.
And the DACA class.
Sure.
So I think the recognition is sort of an understanding of what I said before about the numbers, because when they start to realize who their constituents are and how they're sort of formed and what number of them are immigrants, it becomes even more of an issue. And much like now when the bans happened and the Muslim bans, things that were sort of that mostly affected brown and Black people, when you start thinking about those type of things, there's an awakening of saying, wait, this is the same struggle manifesting itself somewhere else. And that's why you become activated about it. And that's why the Hispanic Caucus and the Black Caucus and the new Progressive Caucus is sort of saying, wait a minute, if race is the factor for determining something, then on our own principle, that's a problem because we're not supposed to see that. We're supposed to see the age, job, where you're categorized from. We shouldn't be looking at country and color to sort of determine if you're a good immigrant or a bad immigrant or a favored immigrant or a non-favored immigrant. Those things just should not exist in our policy at all. If we want to be who we say we are. And that's the biggest problem, that when you sort of remove it from one area, it just shifts to another area because the conversation is, well, it was so much easier to deport to Haiti because it's closer than some of these other countries, or we were able to fill the flights more. There's already another issue already ready in the can to say, oh, there's a non-discriminatory issue for that. Well, sometimes those issues just don't hold water. And when you sort of look at the numbers just alone and the ramifications on those communities, right, deporting kids to Haiti that are 2 months old, right, doesn't make sense. And it's not American policy. Maybe they don't get to stay, but they don't get to go to a country that's in rest and probably exposed them to COVID. That just shouldn't happen.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned something earlier that I think we have to focus in. I mean, one of the key features of the 1965 Immigration Act was the removal of so-called country of origin quotas, which differentiated and higher quotas from some countries and lesser quotas from other countries. And it equalized the quotas all around the world. But we still have per country quotas. So we look at where you're coming from as much or more so than what you are bringing to the United States with you in terms of your own human capital. Other countries in the world don't do that usually. So do you see that as sort of one of the fundamental things we need to look at and address? Like that system that we thought was going to be an equalizer turned out to have that famous word in civil rights law, disparate impact.
Absolutely. That's exactly the root of it. When you started a policy, it was going to be good and you sort of see the impact of it now and your other policies just don't address it. But once again, when you have the factor of the country of origin or passports as the factor, then why is that do they need to come or do they don't need to come? And I think one of the issues that's going to be changing for people is next year when they see that an African-American person born in this country is the president of the Immigration Association, which I will be the first to sort of have that conversation and sort of bring all of my diversity to the table to say he's black, he's gay, he's from the South, he was a Republican. All of these conversations become important in sort of moving the system forward to find a solution, because immigration should not be partisan.
Well, that brings me to my last and most important question, because we are on a podcast from the Bipartisan Policy Center. How do you see, I mean, especially, frankly, in the wake of what happened January 6th, how can we bring a level of bipartisanship to this debate about equity and ending racism in the immigration system? I mean, unfortunately, for many people, that has become a partisan issue, but how can we really bring people together there?
Yeah, when we move away from the scarce good conversation that someone's taking something or being given something they don't deserve, to the humanitarian conversation of this sort of Christian life that many Americans spout to have, or this religious caring. And as we move to the conversation of saying, okay, what is the human thing to do in this condition? Maybe not give everybody an answer, but maybe let people stay here. Someone's been here for, most of the immigrants that are here undocumented have been here for 30 years or more, right? We sort of look at the different numbers from different countries, what we've done across the board, right? Most asylum cases until last year were from China, right? Not from Latin America altogether. So once you have the education, you can make the right response from a human condition of saying, what would I want to happen to me? Secondly, take responsibility of the things that are the push to drive immigration here. If you have driven policies in countries that are causing people to migrate, then address those policies. You can't say people are smuggling in drugs without saying people in the U.S. are using drugs, right? If there's no call for that, then people wouldn't be smuggling drugs. But also spend your money and time sort of fixing those issues, saying let's make these stable places, and understand also what you've done to the environment, right? Environmental movement is a very important thing. And if you've sort of done a drought or you polluted most of your continent and you're causing other people to move there, that's a conversation to have, as well as political unrest, the things that we've done in other countries. We've touched Haiti a number of times, didn't make it better. We've also touched Latin America a number of times and didn't make it better. And we let things fail when we should have helped things prop them up to let them last a little bit longer. So when we understand that we're all linked in this together, and it's not as if at someday there's going to be this great border that we had last year because of COVID, and we still exist. Existing alone in a global world will not make us as strong as we've been in the past. And that's why we continue to go further and further down. When we think about our Nobel Prize winners, when we think about our athletes, when we think about our scholars and our teachers, all of that is our food, our culture, all based on immigration. That's why the nation is so strong. The immigrants that chose to come here, and also a recognition that there is something to be said. As a black person that was born here, to say, yeah, our nation is made of immigrants, but they're also the slave understanding. Our nation was built by slaves. The capital was built by slaves. And we also owe them credit to say, yes, some people came here by choice, some people didn't come here by choice, and we're benefiting from that.
Yeah. You spoke a little bit right there about this idea of addressing what's going on in the countries, some of which the United States may be responsible for. Biden has made a big point of addressing root causes, but, I'd say the United States in trying to, fix things, I'm putting that in air quotes, particularly in Central American countries, we have a mixed history there. What do you think? And even if we do, these are long-term prospects, right? It's not, if we start investing now, we're not going to turn around migration from Central America in 6 months, right? So how do you think, there's been also talk about regional migration solutions and working with these other countries. How do you see that playing out? And is there a way, particularly with a racially equitable lens, to say maybe these countries should lead in that discussion rather than the United States?
Exactly. They should be welcome to the table. And also, you shouldn't tell a country what their right political structure should be, right? Democracy may be right for many, but in other countries, they may just not be at that level yet. And even this country is still growing on its own democracy that we've really just seen. So a lot of that is about letting people, you can't talk about us without us is the real answer, right? Solutions are built on people who know the problem. These are not science projects or science things to sort of for you to fix, right? You're not going to be that great American savior, and many people call the great white savior in these different places. And maybe that's been part of the problem. When you remove yourself from that and you sort of look at the World Health Organization and sort of what the UN was supposed to be, you start seeing a little bit more equity that's sort of formed. and that's just where we need to go and to see where it leads us. But as we know, as we go down this chain, we'll have to say, just like we did with the 1965 Act, where we thought this was right, if we see something that isn't having the right effect, then we need to address it and not keep living with it and saying, oh, okay, we'll get to it. Because the issue with immigration reform in this country is for 30 years, nothing has happened. And we can look to the executive branch to do immigration policy when it's really the job of Congress. And so my year as president is going to be about, it is time to make Congress act, hold the right person accountable. We shouldn't be talking about Trump's immigration policy or Biden's immigration policy. We should talk about this Congress's immigration policy. What was their policy?
America's
what
immigration
did they get pushed?
policy,
What
right?
bills did they address? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, we've been saying that a lot, and people have been listening to our podcast, hear us a lot about we need to put the responsibility where it actually lies on Congress, that relying on the executive to fix the holes in our immigration system that's creaking and rocky and broken in so many places leads to, frankly, the whiplash we've seen in the last 8 years of policies going from, the early Obama administration and major deportations there to changes in DACA to Trump to now Biden. Like Congress needs to get its act together and move on this.
Right. It's the exact same thing we should learn from those Central American countries with those unstable governments. As soon as the leader moves, the government moves. And that's the same thing that sort of happened with immigration. As soon as the president moves, something else happens. And so when you don't have the stability that you want to have here, because you have the wrong person doing it, then that should tell you what the solution should be. And specifically, the other thing that these are not things, these are people. I want to remind people of that. We're not talking about furniture. We're not talking about chairs or trees. These are living individuals. These are living children. And if you see them, you would not treat them that way.
I think that's a really great place for us to sort of end on that reminder that whenever we talk about immigration, it's not some obscure academic policy issue. It really is at the end about people. Allen Orr, thank you so much for joining us today on This Week in Immigration. Listeners, you can follow Allen on Twitter at Allen Orr ESQ, and he's online at Orr Immigration, and you will be seeing and hearing a lot of him over the next year or so in his role as president of the American Immigration Lawyers Association. Allen, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
That's it for today's show. Before we go, a quick reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all of the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow us on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. Theresa is on Twitter at BPC_T Brown. And Allen is also on Twitter at Allen Orr ESQ. I'm Rachel Iacono. This Week in Immigration was created by Theresa Cardinal Brown. The executive producer of This Week in Immigration is Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Theresa Cardinal Brown and myself. Yafet Tawahada produces and edits our show. See you next time on This Week in Immigration.